Assalamu alaikum everyone. I'm Dr. Neelam and I will be discussing data collection with you. Data collection is the heart of research and it is an extremely important part of any research because the conclusion of a study are based on what the data reveal. The learning objectives of these sessions are that at the end, the student should be able to define data and types of data, distinguish between primary and secondary data, describe the data collection procedure. So before discussing the data collection procedure, just a recap of what actually data is. So this term refers to any kind of information the researchers obtain on the subjects, respondents, or participants of a study. And in research, data are collected and used to answer the research questions or objectives of the studies. So the examples of data are demographic information such as age, sex, household size, civil status or religion, social and economic information, and similarly health status, living conditions, and all these are included in different types of the data. So what is data collection? Data collection is a term that is used to describe a process of preparing and collecting data, systematic gathering of data for a particular purpose from various sources that has been systematically observed, recorded, and organized. And data are the basic inputs to any decision-making process. So what is the main purpose of data collection? Why it is important to collect data? The basic purpose of data collection is to obtain information regarding any issue of concern and to keep on a record and then to make decisions about important issues. And this data is then used to pass information to others. The data which is collected is usually used to monitor and evaluate effectiveness of interventions to improve health, and these all in turn helps in setting up the policy goals. There are different types of data. Fundamentally, two types of data is discussed mostly, and just brushing up your previous knowledge. So I would be discussing the quantitative and qualitative data. So quantitative data are basically numbers. It deals with the tests, countings, and measurements. And the qualitative data, it is usually related to words, images, observations, photographs, and conversations. So which data should be used if you want to conduct a statistical analysis that you want to be precise, that you want to measure and you want to cover a large group? So we go for the quantitative data. And if we want to narrate, then in-depth information is taken and we are not sure what we are able to measure and do not need to quantify the results, then for that we go for the qualitative data. Besides this, there are basically two types of data. One is the primary data and the other is the secondary data. Primary data refers to the information that is obtained firsthand by the researcher on the variables of the interest, whereas the secondary data is the information that is gathered from already existing sources. So methods of the data collection. Data collection methods are twofold. One is the secondary sources and the other is the primary sources. And the secondary sources are usually the data is gathered from the documents, which involves government publications, previous researches, census, personal records, client histories, service records, and we are going to discuss these in detail. Whereas the primary sources of the data are direct observations of the participants, interviewing the participants through structured questionnaires, mailed questionnaires, or unstructured questionnaires. and then the questionnaires are used for collection of the data. So the primary data, as already discussed, that it is the data which are collected from the field under the control and supervision of an investigator. It is the original data that has been collected specially for a purpose in the mind, and this type of data are generally collected for the first time. It is useful for the current studies as well as for the future studies. For example, if you want to conduct some research and if you go in the field and you administer your own questionnaire, so this is going to be your primary data. There are different methods of collecting primary data: observation method, personal interviews, telephonic interviews, and mail surveys. The observation method is basically done through personal observation. Personal interviews are done through questionnaires. Telephone interviews are done through calls, and the mail surveys are done through mailed questionnaires. The secondary data is the data that is gathered and recorded by someone else prior to and for a purpose other than the current project. Basically, this is the data which is gathered by someone else for some other reasons, but you use that data for your analysis or for your study, then this is going to be a secondary data. Secondary data is the data that has been collected for another purpose. It involves less cost, time, and effort, as you don't have to go in the field, you don't have to collect on your own. The data has already been collected and then you just analyze it and you just do whatever you want to. So the secondary data is the data that is being reused and usually in a different context. And the examples are, for example, data from a book. So the sources of secondary data are the files, records, computer databases, industry or government reports, other reports or prior evaluations, census data and household surveys, electronic mailing lists and discussion groups, documents, which includes budgets, organizational charts, policies and procedures, maps, monitoring reports, and then newspapers and television reports. And the data, if you take the data from these and you do your own research, so that is going to be called as the secondary researches and the secondary data analysis. Coming to the advantages and disadvantages of the primary data. So the advantages is that targeted issues are addressed since the data is collected by the person going in the field and this is the first-hand data. So there is a purpose in mind for which the data is being collected. That is, the targeted issues are addressed. Then the data interpretation is better, efficient spending for information is there, the data is there are no issues of ownership, and it addresses specific research issues, and you have a control over your own data. The disadvantages are obviously high cost for data collection. You have to spend a lot of money, you have to hire the data collectors, you have to hire them and provide them with the fuel, the cost of the printing, and then in certain cases you have to provide incentives to the participants from which the data is being collected. So it is also time consuming, and inaccurate feedbacks can be there, and more number of resources is required. Coming to the advantages and disadvantages of the secondary data. So the secondary data is readily available. The basic advantage is the ease of access, and the second most important advantage is that low cost to acquire, as you don't have to hire the data collectors and there is no cost on data collection. Clarification of the research questions, and it may answer your research question. But the disadvantages are that the quality of the research is questionable and not specific to the researcher's need. That can be a scenario. Incomplete information may be there and not timely. And besides this, the reliability and the validity of the data is also a question. Data collection. So the robust data collection is based on a good research questionnaire. Common data collection methods or tools which are used in research are questionnaires, interviews, observations, archival documents, and government sources, laboratory experiments. So basically, in this slide, I have mentioned both the tools for collecting the primary and the secondary data. Different strategies are used for data collection, and no one best way is there. The decision for collecting data depends on what you need to know, whether you want to count numbers or you want stories. So for numbers, you will go for quantitative data, and for stories, you will go for qualitative data. Where the data reside, whether it is in the environment, the files, the people. So again, this over here, I'm talking about the primary and the secondary data. Then the data collection strategies depends on the resources and the time available, the complexity of the data to be collected, frequency of the data collection, and intended forms of the data analysis. So all these things, all these points are going to define that which strategy should be adopted. Now coming to the data collection procedure. So there are 5 steps in the data collection procedure. The first and the most important is designing the questionnaire. If your questionnaire is well structured, the quality of the data is going to be very good. And it is very important to mention the details of the questionnaire, the variables, the references if standard questions used, and translate details if applicable. The next step is training of the data collectors and field testing. So before sending the data collectors to have to collect data, it is very important that they should be trained on the questionnaires. All their queries should be solved, and they should be very clear about the questions which they are going to ask from the participants. And then before actually collecting the data, field testing or pre-testing is very important. So in this, what happens that the data collectors after the training go in the field, they they administer the questionnaires, and then they come back to you, to the principal investigator, and they come back with the queries and with the difficulties. And then it is very important part that the queries are solved over here to avoid any biases in future. Then the third step is field supervision. So once the training of the data collectors is done and they are in the field, so it is the responsibility of the principal investigator and the team leader to go in the field and supervise the data collectors and observe whether they are collecting data in a proper way. Then data quality checks. So we do office editing or field editing to see the completeness of the data, to see whether there are any mistakes. So data quality checks are important in that regard. And then is the data entry. So usually double entry is done to avoid any biases or errors, and cross validation is done. So validation and reliability, validity, we will discuss these in coming few lectures. So the qualitative research methods used in data collection are one-to-one interviews, focus group discussions. We already have discussed that all of these in the previous lectures, that in one-to-one interview there will be the interviews are conducted from a person and the interviewer, that is basically in-depth interviews. Then the second is the focus group discussion, in which there are 6 to 8 people and there is a discussions. And then there are ethnographic research, then there is case study research, a record keeping and process of observations. So these are basically some of the methods which are used in the data collection in qualitative research methods. When we talk about the quantitative data collection tools, so this is again face-to-face, online, on phone, and on mail. And in this quantitative data collection, we basically administer the questionnaires. The difference between the quantitative and the qualitative data collection methods. So the quantitative data collection methods are basically fixed and more structured techniques, whereas the qualitative data is semi-structured and unstructured technique. The instruments are test-based, and in qualitative data collection, no instruments or test-based. So in quantitative, the number based to collect information. So there are numbers. We usually collect information in number form, whereas in qualitative, we collect the information in text form. The qualitative data is usually measurable, and the quantitative cannot be measured. We use different statistical tests in qualitative data, and we usually use large samples, whereas in qualitative data we do not use any statistical tests, and this is usually done on a small sample size. In quantitative data, we employ a strong scientific control, and the data type is usually rational or interval, and interviews from forms include close-ended questionnaires. On the other hand, in qualitative data collection, so it lacks strong scientific control. The data is usually ordinal or nominal, and the interview forms include open-ended questions. So there are some of the rules for collecting data, which are that multiple data collection methods should be used, and if you want to use the available data, then it is very important to know that how the measures were defined, how the data was collected, how the data was cleaned, what was the extent of the missing data, and what was the accuracy of the data. So these are basically some of the few important points which are which you have to keep in mind while if you go for the secondary data analysis. With this, we come to the end of the presentation. In case of any queries, you can email me or you can ask me, and I will get back to you. Thank you so much. Allah Hafiz.